Hi everyone, Alice here. This is chapter 4, Prenatal Development and Birth. We'll try and get through the first 11 slides here in about this 15-minute video. These 11 slides are going to focus mostly on the breakdown of the time during prenatal development. You can see here there are 3 time periods that are identified: germinal period, embryonic period, and fetal period. So the next few slides are going to kind of investigate what's going on and the time frames for each of these 3 periods. So basic breakdown: germinal is the first 2 weeks. A lot of times I like to look at this slide, kind of pop ahead a couple. As far as the germinal period goes, it's the journey of the egg going through conception and then finally implanting, which can be up to 2 weeks. Approximately 2 weeks to implantation, and so that's what we call the germinal period. Embryonic period starts then after that. It's about the 3rd week to the 8th week. Notice this is very different than first trimester, second trimester, 3rd trimester. Embryonic period, the second part of the breakdown here, only gets us through about the 2nd month. A lot of important things going on during the embryonic period. It's a time when a lot of different structures are forming for the fetus. It's a bit of a vulnerable time, and we'll talk about teratogens in the next video. Teratogens are different sorts of problems that can happen for the developing fetus. Typically, one example of a teratogen would be a chemical substance that might be ingested. For instance, alcohol is too much alcohol taken at an unsafe level, and a lot of doctors would probably say any amount of alcohol could risk harm to the baby. So that would be called a teratogen. There are a lot of different kinds of teratogens. Rubella or measles can be a teratogen as well, as another example. Radiation, a 3rd example of teratogens. But these sorts of teratogens can be problems, especially during the embryonic period when different body structures are developing. Further along in the material here, you have a chart in these PowerPoints that show you the most vulnerable time periods for each of the different developing body parts. As a matter of fact, I will try to show that to you right now. Here we go. So across the top there are birth defects from teratogens. So the central nervous system, think the brain and spinal cord, is vulnerable throughout the entire pregnancy. But if you look at development of arms, for example, weeks 4 through 5 or 6 here, according to this chart, is the time period when arms developing could be most impacted by a potential teratogen. So we'll talk more about teratogens later, but I wanted to introduce this chart briefly just to sort of highlight this embryonic time period and the fact that those body structures are developing and could be vulnerable to outside influences, we'll call them, or teratogens. So again, we'll visit that more later. So fetal period is 9th week all the way through birth. It's the longest period here, and we see the fetus growing in size, maturing and functioning, getting to the point where it will be ready for birth. So this slide gives us a little bit more about the germinal period, elaborating on things. We've already covered the first couple here. Also, there's the development of the placenta. That's the organ that's surrounding the embryo. It sustains life. It has the umbilical cord that is attaching mother to the fetus and will feed and nurture the developing fetus. So this also mentions that critical moment of implantation in the uterine lining. This is the picture that I showed you earlier, showing the travels, we'll say, of the ovum once it's released from the ovary going down the fallopian tube and implanting the uterine lining. Embryonic period is that week 3 through 8. So remember, we mentioned that there are a lot of different body parts developing. Here, I'll move that a little bit, so hopefully you'll be able to see it a little bit better. So we have eyes, ears, nose, mouth, all the different ways that our senses, or the different organs that our senses will be utilizing in order to bring in information from the outside world. All this information will be processed eventually by our central nervous system, our spinal cord, and our brain, ultimately. So the start of the development of the central nervous system is critical here as well. It's called the primitive streak. Let's see, I can, sometimes you can see some of these pictures of the embryonic period will show you it's a little bit of a different view of maybe a developing brain and spinal cord. A lot of great photos these days on the web. So this primitive streak will become the neural tube, eventually become the brain, spinal cord, central nervous system. The heart actually starts pulsating. We'll have fingers and toes. The embryo can respond to touch. It can move around a bit. So a lot going on during the embryonic period. Fetal period is when the fetus is starting to put on a bit of weight and to mature more so. So it's trying to get ready to be viable or to be born and live on its own. So that's a very important thing that's going on here for this developing baby in these weeks, 9th week on through birth. Another key thing is that genitals will be forming. So the sex of the baby will be determined here, or will be exhibited here, and sex hormones will cause some differences in the brain organization. We don't get into that very much here in this course, but there are lots of studies on how hormones impact either development of male or female brain, and actually throughout the lifespan, how male versus female brains might be different. Okay, so moving along, we also have a description. We have a couple of keywords here: cephalocaudal and proximodistal. So what does this mean? We're using these two words when we talk about the fetus's growth. So cephalocaudal is from top to bottom. So there will be a lot of growth with the head, with the brain and the head. First, and then growth will go from there, top to bottom. Proximodistal is from the inside out, so inner to outer. So extremities will be the final growth that happens for the fetus. So you might want to jot these two words down, cephalocaudal and proximodistal, and what they mean, and how it describes the development of the fetus. So a lot going on here in this fetal period. They also talk about the growth in the brain. This is so critical. The brain needs to be mature enough to support life outside of the womb. It needs to be able to survive birth and get the baby a start in the world, so to speak. So there's quite a bit of growth going on with the brain here. So a couple of things I like to point out is neurogenesis, which is yet another term you want to jot down. So neurogenesis means the creation of new neurons. So new neurons are being created here in the brain. And actually, we have neurogenesis throughout our lifespan. For a long time, it was thought that we only had new brain cells before we were born, but that has been proven not to be true. We can develop new brain cells, new neurons throughout life. So, but During development as a fetus, quite a bit of neurogenesis. Also synaptogenesis, which is creation of synapses. So synapse is that space between the neurons, and we'll talk more about neurons and synapses later. Need to know there's a little space. It's called the synapse, and it's basically where communication happens between neurons. So these connecting points, they don't actually touch, but these connecting areas are growing. There are more connections between neurons. So the cortex is not yet fully mature, that outer part, but the brain is the biggest part of the baby at birth. You probably know that or have heard it, that the head is the biggest part of the baby at birth. Okay, so this shows us a bit of fetal development throughout these weeks before the birth. So here's 25 days. You can see not very much growth and development in the brain compared to down here 35 to 40 weeks. So after 35 weeks up to 40, that's more full term. Prior to 35 weeks would be called preterm. So preterm is very concerning for brain development. So before 35 weeks, you can see even in these sort of sketches of the brain at 28 weeks is very different looking from 35 to 40 weeks. So we really need the brain development for the baby in order to support breathing and life. So you can see the developing brain here from 25 days all the way through 35 to 40 weeks. So the age of viability where babies today, generally speaking, can be born and make it with usually some support, technological support, is about 22 weeks. So I'm going up and down here with the cursor. Right in between here is about where the babies seem to have enough brain development in order to maintain life. Okay, so this age of viability then is a term that you want to jot down and make sure you remember. So it starts about 22 weeks after conception, and this is the time frame when the baby might be able to survive outside the womb with some medical or technical sort of technological support, machines, think of it. So with medical care. The brain is able to regulate enough of the basic body functions for the baby to be viable. Okay, so every day that you get past those 22 weeks is really good, which is why I sometimes come across women being asked to be on bed rest for some reason. They're trying to get the baby more developed in order for the best chance of survival at birth. So any day that you can get past 22 weeks, any week that you can get is wonderful, that the baby can go through more development. Okay, so I think we just have one more slide here today in this video. And I appreciate this slide quite a bit, and I'll try and share it with you in this last minute that I have. This is highlighting the vulnerability. This is a vulnerable time. So during the germinal period, remember that's the first 2 weeks, about half of all conceptions do not implant, they do not grow. And probably it's because there's an abnormality, a chromosomal abnormality, and so that that egg does not implant. The embryonic period, about 20% of all embryos are spontaneously aborted. Again, chromosomal abnormalities. And even the fetal period, about 5% of all fetuses are aborted spontaneously before getting to 22 weeks. So if it's after 22 weeks, between 22 and full term, then that would be called stillborn. That's defined then, as you can see here, as born dead after 22 weeks. So the bottom line there, birth, about 31% of all zygotes grow and survive to become living newborn babies. It's a vulnerable time.